I want to thank everybody for coming down on this wet night. Dr. McIntyre, I saw speak many years ago. One of the people, students, put on the Facebook page, he's a rock star, and I think that that's fair. I found that it was very engaged thinking that he was able to bring out with people, and that's what we're hoping. That's what we're hoping to do this evening. He hails from UMass Amherst, and has written a book on labor relations, the last one. And without any further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Ric McIntyre. Give him a hand.
You know, when I was 20, I wanted to be a rock star. I really did. I really did. I'm going to talk about this word, socialism. And it's remarkable to me that here we are in 2016, and so many people are interested in this word. And we're going to talk about a few different kinds of socialism, especially this democratic socialism, whatever the heck that is. The title, though, is Democratic Socialism and You. So this is the and you part right now. So what I'd like you to do is turn to the people next to you. You can actually turn around and talk to the people behind you. They're very nice looking people. And groups of 5 or 6, talk to each other about what democratic socialism means to you. We're going to take about 5 minutes to do that, and then I'm going to have some of the groups report back and see what we get. Okay? This is jazz, it's not classical. Okay? Okay, here we go. Oscar.
Socialism is more a we instead of an I, and I'm democratic, that like we all choose what we think is best for all of us instead of more communism when someone chooses what's best for all of us.
Wow, that's pretty good.
Yeah, a lot of us didn't hear that, right? So we have no idea what he said. Can we have a recap?
Louder, Oscar.
Socialism is more like an us, like a we instead of like a me.
Right.
And then democratic, that like we all choose what's best for all of us instead of like what people think about communism, that it's just one guy who chooses what's best for all of us.
Did you get that part?
No.
Okay. Socialism is us instead of I. And democratic socialism is we all get to choose rather than having somebody choose for us. Somebody must have taught you well. Somebody else. Not a student. Yes?
More specifically, on follow-up, is socialism is control of the economy for the interests of the people instead of for the interests of few that are now controlling it for profit, at the expense of nature, at the expense of society, and at the expense of people.
Okay, control of the economy for in the interests of
people. Democracy.
Okay.
People, us.
Anybody else? Jonathan?
We were just talking about, it's kind of a commitment to look out for each other, and that a lot of people don't realize, and Bernie's talking about this, that we do have socialism in our society right now. There's a lot of social programs where it's trying to support each other.
We're going to talk about that tonight too. Some of those programs might be socialism, some of them might be something else. That's good. One more.
I would say that we already have socialism. We have single-payer medicine already.
We do?
We do.
That happened today?
We have it in the VA.
Ah.
And we have it in Medicare.
Okay.
We already got it. And it works. And compare on a cost basis, it's brilliant. It already works. So now, what I'm confused about is what is the difference between socialism and democratic socialism? That's why I'm here tonight.
All right. Well, let's see if we can help you out then.
All right. That's why I'm here.
We're gonna figure it out.
One more from our group over here.
One more.
So I think that the democratic part of it is a normal capitalist society.
Yep.
And I think the socialism part of it is taking certain aspects from that capitalist society and making it a socialist part. So say healthcare, for instance, making that universal, or taking the cost of college education and making that free. So I think it's a blend of a capitalist and socialist.
So you think democratic socialism is a blend of capitalism and socialism?
Yeah.
Okay. Isms. All these isms. Every year, Merriam-Webster, the dictionary people, they tell us what was the most searched word in their website every year. And last year it was minions, it was the film, and isms was number one. All kinds of isms. The one that was searched on the most, though, was this one, socialism. More than any other single word. Now, what's the opposite of socialism? Capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism.
Individual.
Right? Socialism is social. The opposite of the social is the individual. Now, we know enough from the horrid history of the 20th century to know that you need, as a good society, to respect the integrity of the human individual. That's very important, right? But we also know that we are social animals. That ever since we came down from the trees, or wherever it is we came down from, we have lived in groups. And those groups need to make rules. So we can't help but be social. Socialism is social, right? So the opposite of socialism is individualism, although most people think it's this-ism. Capitalism. Now, I bet if we went around the room, we would find a diversity of opinion on what capitalism is, just like we found out with socialism, okay? So I'm not going to define it yet. It'll be defined as we go through the discussion. But most people would say, that's the opposite of this, whereas I really think it's this. We'll talk more about these things and this idea of blending as we go forward, okay? Whoa! Whoa! There's your 25-cent word of the night. Capitalocentrism. I'm borrowing that from feminist theory and Jacques Derrida, I don't want to scare anybody here, who talk a lot about phallocentrism, right? The privileging of the male gaze. The privileging of the male position in society, phallocentrism. Well, capitalocentrism is the privileging of capital. And you all, being an above-average audience, immediately said, well, we already have some socialism. It's not all capitalism in the United States. We already know that. Most people don't. They don't know that. That they think that what we have is capitalism, and we either have to make that good or suffer with it being bad. We don't really talk about other things. I want to get away from this capitalocentrism. I'm going to come back to that. Okay? For me, socialism comes down to who controls capital, who's in charge, and which do we privilege? Labor, work, or capital, ownership? I think socialism means that those who do the work are in charge, and labor is privileged over capital. Okay? I'll come back to that. Some of you may have seen the movie The Princess Bride, one of my favorite movies. You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. So there are some subtle differences here that I'm going to get into with these words. Social democracy, economic democracy, democratic socialism, the big one that we want to talk about. State socialism, which most people think that's what they had in the Soviet Union. I would argue what they had was state capitalism. They just replaced the capitalists with the commissars. There's really no difference. They had dictatorial state capitalism. But I want to distinguish especially between these three things: social democracy, economic democracy, and democratic socialism. This is the phrase that Bernie uses. This is what he says he is. I think he's this. Okay? I think he's a social democrat. That's not a bad thing. But I don't think he does much of this and much of this. And what I'm going to argue when we get to it is that if he really wants to do this, he better think about these things too. Okay? Socialisms. Just like there are many different kinds of capitalisms, German capitalism, Scandinavian capitalism, Japanese capitalism, there's many kinds of socialisms. These ideas have been around hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. But modern socialism really starts with the Industrial Revolution, when the conditions in early industry in England, and right up the road here in Pawtucket, right, were so bad that certain well-meaning capitalists, like this guy, Robert Owen, looks like one of those old dead British guys. Robert Owen was a factory owner, and he was horrified by the conditions in his own factories. And so he thought he would start new communities where they could create factories that people were treated well who worked in them, and that when they went home from work they had a place to live and food on the table. Now, Marx's buddy Engels called this utopian socialism, and that word stuck for whatever reason. And what Engels meant by that was, this is all very nice. Robert Owen is well-meaning, but you can't create this in the midst of a capitalist society. The capitalists are just too powerful. They won't allow this to grow. We, Engels said, Marx and I, are going to figure out how socialism can emerge out of capitalism. Well-meaning, but ultimately utopian. But in that well-meaningness, Owen and other early socialists, Proudhon and Saint-Simon in France, pushed some radical ideas of the time. A 10-hour or even an 8-hour workday, because the standard workday was 12 hours, and 8 on Saturday. Factory acts, to inspect the factories, to see whether they were safe, to limit the labor of children. These were radical ideas at that time. This is what socialism meant then. And especially for Owen, it meant this word, cooperation. Capitalism is actually a giant system of cooperation. How many of you made the clothes that you're wearing here tonight? How many of you constructed the vehicle that you drove here tonight? You could do it, Nancy. You could do it. How many of you grew the food that you ate today? Okay, a couple of weirdos. We can't dress, feed, transport, or shelter ourselves without a gigantic system of cooperation. Capitalism, in this sense, is very progressive. It creates this system of cooperation, and yet what we're told is we're all individuals. The ideology is we're all individuals. You should do what's best for yourself. Don't worry about other people. That's the ideology of capitalism. The reality is it's a gigantic system of cooperation. And what Owen wanted to do was to build on that, to recognize the possibilities of creating a cooperative society. That's what socialism meant to him in the early 19th century. This is the young Karl Marx. You usually see him, old with a big beard. That's what he looked like when he was about 30. He wrote the Communist Manifesto. That manifesto is the second most published piece of document in human history behind the Christian Bible. In 1867, he published another very long, very tedious in places book called Capital. I have read all 3 volumes of Capital. First volume is pretty good. Second, third volumes, if you have a long prison sentence, that's the time. Marx identified 2 major, obviously I'm summarizing here, major problems in capitalism. One, it is a system of exploitation. It is a system in which people are not paid the full value of what they produce. Workers produce a certain amount of value, and they are paid less than that. They are exploited. Now, if you think for a couple of minutes, this makes perfect sense, right? Of course, your employer pays you less than the value of what you produce. Otherwise, why would they hire you? They exploit you. And out of that notion of exploitation, Marx built a whole theory of how the labor process works. How capitalists try to increase the length of the working day. How they try to speed up work. How they try to replace skilled workers with unskilled workers. It's a system of exploitation, he said, and we can do better than that. We can build on the cooperative tendency which Owen rightly recognized. And, he said, capitalism is prone to crisis. Every 10 years or so, the economy goes like this. And I've been around long enough to have seen the expansion of the 80s, the expansion of the 90s, the expansion of the 2000s. And every time we get one of these expansions, some smart economist, usually at an Ivy League school, will say, "Oh, we figured it out now. We're in a new economy. We don't have to worry about these things anymore." And then, boom! Reality hits. So Marx said we can do better than this capitalism. Now, Marx did not write much about socialism at all. His big book, Capital, is about capitalism. It's not about socialism. Otherwise, he would have called it social. Right? He didn't call it that. He called it Capital. Now, what he said, though, with his buddy Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, very young, they were very young at the time, 30 years old, it's very young. What is socialism? We will create, he said, an association. An association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That's what the young Marx meant by socialism, an association of people. Now, the fact that some of his followers ended up building something very different from that, not really his fault, right? There's a lot of important people whose followers did some pretty nasty things. I could name a few. I will not do that. Right? Marx didn't write much about socialism. In 1871, though, in Paris, there was a revolution. After the Franco-German War, the Germans imposed a terrible peace on France. The government of France said, okay. The people of Paris said, not okay, we're not doing that. And so came the Paris Commune, Commune de Paris, in which for 2 months the people of Paris ruled the city. And they created what we would recognize now as the first socialist government. What did they do? Participatory democracy. Everybody gets a say. We're going to combat hunger. No one should go hungry. We're going to promote cooperative enterprises in all those factories that the rich people have abandoned. We're going to start them back up. We're going to have a minimum wage. Radical idea at the time. We're going to promote arts and education for everybody. And we're going to guarantee the rights, equal rights for women. That's what socialism meant in Paris in 1871. And then in May, the French government, which was stationed out of Versailles, marched the army into Paris and wiped them out. Slaughtered 30,000 people in a week because these ideas were too dangerous. Too dangerous. They wiped them out. And so after that, socialists said, okay, we better think about what we're doing here. And 2 strands of socialism developed. One was called evolutionary socialism, and the name, if you want to read the literature, is Edward Bernstein. He was a buddy of Engels. He was a German guy. And he said, you know what? As workers get the vote, we can achieve socialism through democracy, through the ballot box. We don't have to have a revolution. Socialism can emerge out of capitalism as workers gain more and more political power. They can vote it in. They can vote it in. Revolution is dangerous. It risks tyranny, he said. There's lots of examples of this, right? Revolution is a risky bet. And it's possible that other classes may ally with the workers. So socialism can evolve out of capitalism. That was Bernstein's idea. Opposed to that was revolutionary socialism. Basically what the revolutionary socialists said was, okay, we got wiped out the last time because they had the guns. Next time, we're going to have the guns. We're going to have guns. And we have to have a revolution. Because what the Paris Commune demonstrated to the revolutionaries, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, was that the capitalist class will never stand for socialism. They will never accept it. They will never accept it peacefully. They will fight it. They will fight it in all kinds of ways, but in the end they'll fight it with violence. And therefore the only way to get there is to overthrow the capitalists. In Russia, for reasons that would take us too long to get into, but in Russia, it succeeded in 1917, in October. The Bolsheviks took power. But they thought, especially Trotsky, we are taking power in an extremely poor, beat-up country at the end of a war, full of peasants, hardly industrialized at all. If revolutions don't happen in other countries, we're screwed. We need friends. And we especially need friends in Germany, because Germany was the leading power in Central Europe. And there was a revolution in 1919 in Germany, but it failed. Rosa Luxemburg, one of the leaders, was assassinated. The revolutions that Trotsky hoped for did not occur. So now you have a problem. Some elements in Russia said we can't create socialism on our own. We have to get there through capitalism. Capitalism builds up the economy. That's what capitalism does. It creates technological marvels. It increases productivity. And if we're going to have socialism, we need a high level of productivity. So we can't get there. Stalin, who was more interested in holding on to power, invented this idea of socialism in one country. We can do this. And he and Trotsky, Lenin died, he and Trotsky battle. It's a very interesting history, I'm not going to go into it. And Stalin comes out on top. And after 1927, we have state socialism in Russia. Now, it's popular to believe that nothing good came out of that. That turns out not to be true. Okay? They successfully industrialized. A very poor country, in 15 years, was industrialized. Industrialized to the point where they beat the Nazis in World War II. They beat the greatest war machine ever created. They did that. Americans think we won the war. In the Pacific, we won the war. In Europe, these guys did. Okay? But they failed utterly in agriculture. They beat back the Tsarist forces, the counter-revolution, partly through terror. They governed partly through terror. They promoted socialist parties abroad, but they also controlled them. The most heartbreaking example of this is the Spanish Civil War, which some of you may know about. So it was a mixed bag. But what they never did, they never promoted what I would call socialism. Workers controlling the fruits of their labor. They simply said, the capitalists are gone, and now we, the Communist Party, acting in the name of the workers, of course, are in charge. But the workers themselves never had a say over what was to happen with the fruits of their labor. They never created worker control of enterprise. Socialism now, and if you look through the dictionaries, it's fascinating. Before the 1930s, you never saw this. Socialism never meant this. It meant cooperation, it meant free association of people, it meant improving conditions of work and life. It never meant state ownership and central planning. That was new. But that's what it came to mean. So when I was growing up, and some of you are even older than me, but when most of us with gray in our hair were growing up, what's socialism? State control, central planning. That's what it is. That was new. It was a new definition. It's not what socialism had meant before. In the West, the Russian Revolution split the socialist movement. Some people said we must now align ourselves with Moscow, and they became communists. Others said, no, I don't know what's going on in Moscow, but that has nothing to do with me. I'm still a socialist. And in some places, groups of social democrats, people who thought you could create social justice within capitalism. You could make capitalism better, came into power. In the 1930s, in Sweden, the Swedish Social Democratic Party, this is Alva Myrdal and Gunnar Myrdal, a very important sociologist and economist. The Social Democratic Party took power in Sweden and ruled for 40 years. 40 years. Let that sink in for a little bit. They created a mighty oak in Sweden, and in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries generally. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway. They had time to integrate these ideas into the very fabric of society. 40 years is time. It's enough time to really change a society. Sweden, by the 1970s, was the most equal society we have ever seen, or that we know of, since recorded history. Income was distributed more equally in Sweden in the 70s than any other society we know of. Since then, governments have gone back and forth. Conservatives, liberals, social democrats. And things have changed in Sweden. It's not quite what it was, but the institutions were very, very strong. And so the Swedish social welfare state, still very, very strong. Unions in Sweden represent 70% of workers. That's down from 90% in the 70s. They had 40 years, we had about 4. In 1934 and 35, something remarkable happened in the United States. And I've been writing about this recently, but I won't go on too long, I promise you. Okay? The Depression was still on, things were still bad, Roosevelt was trying to do a lot of things, but times were still tough. In San Francisco and Minneapolis and Toledo, of all places, there were general strikes. The Communist Party was very strong. Workers were on the streets everywhere. There was a fear of revolution. In 1934, the Democrats won overwhelming majorities in both houses of Congress. And that's when the second New Deal happened. The first New Deal was the first 100 days and all the regulation that happened. The second New Deal was the Wagner Act, which gave workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. The Social Security Act, which meant that being old didn't mean you were going to be poor. And finally, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the minimum wage, and the 8-hour day. All passed in a 3-year period. The beginnings of something like social democracy in the United States. And then it all fell apart in just a couple of years at the end of the 30s. And it fell apart because of race. The Democratic Party was an alliance of northern progressives and southern racists. That's what it was. And those southern racists represented the plantation owners in the South. And they said, this is why the Wagner Act and many of these acts exclude domestic workers and agricultural workers. because they were concerned with maintaining control over black labor. And by 1937, they had figured out that this new labor movement, especially the UAW, the United Auto Workers, were serious about creating a black-white alliance. They were serious about trying to overcome racism. And the Southern Democrats got off the bus and allied themselves with the Republicans. And from that point on, the effective governing party in the United States, for many, many years, was an alliance of Southern Democrats and Republicans. World War II contributed to this by rehabilitating the capitalists. The capitalists, especially the bankers, after the Depression, you know, the bankers got blamed for the Depression. They probably deserved it. So they were kind of out of power, kept at arm's length. But if you're going to fight a world war, you need capitalists. So they were rehabilitated. And so in Sweden they had 4 years and built a very strong social democracy. Not socialism. Capitalism still exists in Sweden. But a very strong social democracy. We built a weak one because Roosevelt had such a short period of time to work with. You get that? What were the consequences of this social democracy? Well, they were different in different places, right? So this is really grossly over-summarized. But there was a long boom after World War II. Long boom. From the 40s to the 70s, pretty steady growth. It was widely shared. You may not be able to see this little diagram. It's getting a little bit too cute. But basically, the group whose incomes grew the most rapidly in that period were those at the bottom. 118% increase in income between 47 and 79. Those whose incomes grew the slowest were the top 5%, which grew at 86%. Now, they still grew, but the benefits of growth were tilted a little bit towards the bottom, and more so in other countries that had stronger social democracies. 79 to 2008, exactly the opposite. Incomes have fallen at the bottom, risen at the top, and really risen at the very top. But here's the problem, one of the problems with capitalism, right? We want to make capitalism good. We want full employment. Everybody should have a job. Well, if everybody has a job, then workers can ask for raises because they can't be replaced. There's upward pressure on wages and prices. Now in Sweden, they dealt with this in a very clever way. They had what was called peak bargaining between the Central Union Federation and the Central Employer Federation. And what they said is, okay, we're Sweden, we're a little country. We have to remain internationally competitive. So wages can't rise faster than productivity. So every year you're going to get a wage increase, and it's going to be just a little bit less than the rate of productivity growth. And that way prices don't have to go up. It was a deal. Organized capitalism. Did we have that in the United States? Say no. No, we didn't have that. Okay? So when we reached full employment at the end of the 60s, there was pressure for prices to rise. That was exacerbated by the oil price increases of the 1970s, where the price of oil quadrupled. So that system ended somewhat badly. Inflation created a crisis. There was already kind of a cultural revolt because not everybody shared in the boom. Third world, many workers were not upset that they were not getting enough youth. These people over here, the top, we're not getting enough. And this inflation now is eroding our profits. Something must be done. So there was what I call neoliberal counter-revolution. Now this word neoliberal is tough for people in the United States. Everywhere outside the United States, the word liberal means a believer in free markets and individual freedom. Here we think it means Hillary Clinton. Strange thing. So a neoliberalist is a revival of the belief that free market capitalism will work. That's what it is, okay? And a lot of money was poured into creating books like Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, which, by the way, I suggest you read. It's very easy to read. It's very clear. It's very clear what Friedman stands for. Very well written. I'm not saying I agree with it, by the way. Okay, I don't want anybody to take them, but it's worth reading. And politicians, we had our Reagan, but this lady here, Margaret Thatcher, with her phrase, there is no alternative. There's no alternative to free markets. If you start down the road towards socializing things, you end up with the Soviet Union. There's no alternative. That was her argument. Very powerful arguments in the late 1970s and 80s. And they won. What were the consequences? Slower growth. Rising inequality. Rising debt and financial crises. Cheap stuff. Because of globalization. Because we're going to have free markets, free trade. We're going to let goods be produced where they are produced most cheaply. I go to the store, I can't believe how cheap clothes are. They're giving them away. Slavery, it's wonderful. You understand? That's why your goods are so cheap. Narrowing of political choices. This is an important one. The center-left parties, like the Democrats, like Labour in England, moved to the right. And so this is what Clinton was, right? Those of you who remember Bill Clinton, his whole strategy was the Republicans are here, the Democrats are here, I'm going to be here. That was his whole, it's called triangulation, right? And so there really was no even center-left choice in the United States anymore. In England, Labour called itself New Labour. We're new. We're not like old Labour, we're New Labour. Tony Blair moving towards the right. So the choices on the menu began to get narrower. Politics became about less and less. And then two things happened. There was a financial collapse in 2008. It was bad. It was bad. The only reason we did not get another Great Depression is because of, like it or not, the Federal Reserve, which flooded the system with money and pushed interest rates to zero, and Obama's stimulus policy. Not big enough, but put some people back to work. Otherwise, the numbers are crazy. They parallel what happened in 29, 30, and 31 perfectly until the end of 2009, and then it starts to come back up. The state bailed out capitalism. So it's almost like, you know that scene in The Wizard of Oz where the curtain comes open and you can see the wizard? And he says, "Don't look at that man." This was, for a lot of people, a kind of an eye-opening experience. And for some people, it meant the government is too powerful. The government is too powerful. And that became the Tea Party. I gave a talk once in Providence, and a guy came up to me afterwards. This was on the military and military spending. A guy came up to me afterwards. He said, "You know, I'm a fervent Tea Party guy, and I agree with 85% of what you said. But that last 15% is pretty important." Other people had the brilliant idea to go to Zuccotti Park in New York City and camp out. Occupy. And this spread, as you know, around the country. It was brilliant because they didn't ask for anything. Their point was the whole system has to change. No little law, no little regulation. The whole system is corrupt. The banks are in charge. The politicians are bought. Now, a lot of people in regular politics said, oh, it was a big failure. They didn't change anything. I think Occupy changed everything. The discussion now about the 1%, that's where that comes from. The whole discussion of inequality in the United States was completely transformed. And, of course, it fell apart, in New York anyway, as the police started dropping off drug addicts and mentally challenged people in the park. And then, when that even didn't work, they came in and beat the living crap out of everybody. Violence, in the end, is the last line of defense. Beginnings of a new revolt in New York, in Oakland, in Providence, everywhere. This is the Central Square in Madrid, where the indignados of Spain gathered. And now what's happened is a left wing has opened up. As Clinton and Blair and these other center-left people have moved to the right, there's a vacuum. And into that has moved Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece, Bernie Sanders in the United States. It's happening everywhere. Back to this capital S intro now. The history lesson's done. You can breathe out. Oh, no more history. I hate history. This is a diagram that a friend of mine, Ken Byrne, drew a number of years ago, and I really like it. It's called the economic iceberg. And what it shows is the visible part of the iceberg, the part that whenever we talk about economic development is what we talk about, is wage labor for a market in a capitalist firm. What's the economy? What's economic development? It's about capitalism. How can we be more efficient, make more efficient enterprises producing for the market? But that's only part of what we do to survive. And the economy is about how we provision ourselves material for our own survival, right? What do we do? In the neighborhoods, in families. When my kids were growing up, I used to cook. I didn't post a blackboard with the prices of the meals before dinner time. I gave that to them, right? Jonathan, you might. Yeah, I don't know what you do, but that's what I do. Unpaid labor. Work in the church or the temple. Retired people. Gifts between friends. Self-employment. Volunteering. Barter. Cooperatives. Producer cooperatives. Why don't we talk about these things? Because the capitalists don't control those things. And they control the dialogue about what the economy is about. I tell these things to my colleagues in the economics department. They look at me like, this is all part of economic life. Time studies. They're rough, but I think they tell us something. 50% of our time is actually over here. When I used to coach soccer teams, I'm helping raise the next generation of children. That's not counted as economic activity, but if we don't raise another generation to replace us, will there be economic activity in 20 years? No. All of the work we do in our communities is important, but it's not counted as part of economic life because all we see is capitalism. There's a place in Spain, in the Basque region, where there is an organization called the Mondragon Cooperative System. And it started in the 1950s. It was started by a Catholic priest, of all people. The notion that he was going to find a way between Soviet socialism and American capitalism. And the workers were going to own their own firms. And they started making these little cookers, these little stoves. And now 85,000 people belong to this network of cooperatives. They have a bank, they have schools, they have a hospital. They have affiliates now in other countries. This is not the only example, but it's the most successful example. Here's a cooperative that was developed by a friend of mine, Julie Graham, in Massachusetts. I want to read these principles because I think they're really important, the principles of the Mondragon cooperative system. Democratic organization of enterprises. Everybody gets a vote. Sovereignty of labor. Labor is in charge. We need capital. Capital is important. Capital is not in charge. Participatory management. People rotate into management jobs and then rotate back into work. Everybody can be a manager. This is a dirty little secret that they don't want you to know in places like the business school over here. Right? Because they want to control who gets to be a manager. Everybody can be a manager. Income solidarity. That means we limit the gap between what the most highly paid person makes and what the lowest paid person makes. There's differences. They don't all get paid the same, but those gaps are limited. Cooperation between cooperatives. They have an agenda. Their mission is to transform the society. Social transformation through economic activity, education, and culture. If you don't do something like that with and alongside social democracy, I think the social democracy thing is not going to work. Let me talk just for a minute. I'm getting towards the end, so don't get nervous. To me, democratic socialism combines two things: political democracy and economic democracy. Political democracy is very important. It's very important. We don't have one. Be good to have one. How many of you have spent time in England or France or Germany when they're having an election? It's a little different, isn't it? It's fast, TV time is limited, and people can't buy candidates. I mean, our system, you have to get outside the United States for a little while to really see this. This system is gross. It's gross. Right? So we need to do that. But democracy has to be about something other than choosing somebody every 4 years to do something. Why does democracy end at the door of the workplace? Why is it, okay, out here you have democracy, but when you walk through that door, it's a dictatorship? We spend a lot of time at work. A lot of time. Why does democracy end there? I'll talk about that. Why is this word less scary now than it was? Well, part of it, and you see some of these people here, is we have a new generation who have a more favorable view of socialism than an unfavorable view. Young people. The Soviet Union's been gone for 25 years now. Don't let them scare you with that. Socialism has meant many things. Some of them you might like, some of them you may not like. But that's only one. Young people, they don't care about that. Oh, I know some of them do, but not too many, right? So what this graph is, it's showing favorable and unfavorable ratings. My generation up here, well, not so good, but here's what's coming. Generational change, young people. Neoliberal capitalism has obviously failed. Obviously. We lived through that. We know it. The government is obviously bought. Dick Durbin, senator from Illinois, said a couple of years ago, Wall Street owns the Congress. Look it up. This is Dick Durbin, senator. This is not some kooky professor. Wall Street owns the Congress. Or the oil industry, or you pick them, right? This new economy is what we're starting to refer to as a gig economy. How many of you have heard that phrase before, gig economy? Yeah, okay, the young people have heard it, right? That jobs are more like, you know, what happens in the movie industry or what happens to musicians. You get a gig, you work it for a little while, and then you have no gig. And you got to find another gig. And so what's out there on offer, especially for younger people, is not that great. And of course the crisis created a situation where you can't really trust capitalism. You know, there's been 7 major crises since World War II, and if you had 7 major crises in your marriage, you would go to counseling. Right? Capitalism needs to go to counseling. Why not try to make capitalism good? Social democracy. Why not do that? More regulation, change the tax system, tax people at the higher levels. Sure, why not? Nothing wrong with that. We could do it. But the problem is this. The minute that you pass those regulations, and the minute that you pass those higher tax rates, capitalists will go to work to evade them, to find loopholes. That's what corporate lawyers are for. They're very good at it. They will create endowed chairs in the university to teach that these regulations are bad. They will establish foundations and think tanks to have people go on TV and the radio to tell everybody that it's bad. And they will undermine those regulations, and when they've built up enough political power, they'll reverse them. How do we know this? That's what happened to the New Deal. That's what happened. So if you think you can regulate and tax capitalism to make it better, I'm afraid that you might be wrong. Now, some of you might like my buddy Robert Reich. He's a decent human being. He was here. You know, we brought him here to talk a couple of times. I've met him, had dinner with him. He's a nice guy. I hate the title of this book. I hate that. Saving Capital. Why would you want to save that? Really? No. We need to change the way that enterprises are governed. We need democracy in the workplace. Democratically organized enterprises are not likely to pay billions to their stockholders. Not going to happen. They're unlikely to outsource their own jobs to Bangladesh. Not going to happen. They're unlikely to pollute their own communities. Social democracy, fine, but if it's not combined with economic democracy, I don't know how far it goes. Bernie is a social democrat. I know he says he's a democratic socialist, but I think I've shown you that what he is somebody who wants to make capitalism run better. And that may be as far as anyone can go in the United States right now. People say, well, Sanders, you know, he's good, but he's too radical. And then when you show them what Bernie actually stands for, they say, well, you know, actually that kind of makes a lot of sense. Right? But I think he does not go far enough. Now, on the website, there is some discussion of cooperatives. We have a national cooperative bank in the United States. How many of you knew that? Oh, a few of you did. That's good. Okay? It would be wonderful if he and the campaign began to support really funding that bank in a major way to create cooperative enterprises in poor urban communities in the United States next year. If we change the way enterprises are governed, we will bring democracy to work. And that will change the United States. Bernie has clearly tapped into discontent. He is brave. I first saw Bernie speak in 1985. He had become mayor of Burlington. And he came down to UMass, where I was a graduate student, you know, and us left-wing graduate students, you know, we were all very sophisticated, and, you know, we had complex analyses, this, that, and the other thing. And Bernie came in, I'll never forget this, and he said, okay, if you want to be a socialist mayor in a northern city, the first thing you got to do is make sure the streets are plowed. Because if you don't plow the streets, you can take your talk about socialism and you can throw it in the garbage. So, not only is he brave, he is competent. He knows what he's doing. He's a social democrat. His platform would make capitalism better. I'm not sure it would get us to where we need to go. Either way, this is a long-term project. I'm so impressed by the people who have been associated with the campaign, more so than I have, and the work that's gone into this campaign. To really change the United States, it's work that we have to sustain. Thank you. Thank you.